This is the mechanism inside a grasshopper's leg that enables it to jump so high. And it's really clever because it solves a fundamental limitation of animal muscles. Humans come up against the same limitation, but we get around it with tools. And actually, it's kind of two limitations. I'm going to show you how humans deal with the problem first because it's quite instructive. And then we'll see how the same mechanical principles are found inside the grasshopper's body and a few different variations in other animals. So here's a problem that a human might face. There's an object in the distance that I would like to puncture a hole in. And I've got this little steel ball here. So I think if I can get the ball going fast enough, by the time it reaches that thing, maybe it'll puncture a hole in it. And I think, well, how can I do that? I'm going to throw it with my arm. The problem is, the steel ball's quite light, which means it's not offering much inertial resistance to my muscles. So my hand ends up traveling really quickly. And actually, it takes muscles a little bit of time to build up to their maximum force. And by the time the ball has left my arm, I'm nowhere near my maximum force. That's the first limitation of muscles, and it's quite easy to overcome actually in quite a counterintuitive way, and that is to just make the ball heavier. So this ball has much more inertia, so my arm is going to move more slowly when I throw it. But at least it's going to give my muscles a chance to get up to maximum force. And because it's heavier, it's going to have more kinetic energy, meaning when it hits the target, it's going to have more puncturing ability. But this is where we come up against the big limitation of muscles. You can either apply a large force slowly or a small force at high speed. And it's something you've experienced, like if you've ever lifted weights. If it feels heavy to you, you have to lift it slowly. So that makes intuitive sense, but it also makes mathematical sense because what you're experiencing is your muscles' maximum power output. Like, you know that power is a measure of how quickly you can deliver energy. In other words, energy divided by time. But maybe you also know that energy is force times distance moved in direction of force. And if we slide things around to get the force term on its own, you can now see that power is also force times speed. So given that your muscles have a maximum power output, that explains why you can either have a small force moving quickly or a large force moving slowly. But if I want either of these balls to leave my hand with enough speed to puncture the target when it arrives, I need to be applying a large force at high speed. But with my muscles, I can't do both. And that's where the use of tools comes in. The tool in this case is a slingshot. Here in the UK, we call it a catapult, but that's a bit confusing because other things are called catapults, so I'll keep calling it a slingshot probably. The elastic of this thing is really strong. So to pull it back, I have to use a large force, which means I have to move my muscles slowly. But that's fine because what I'm doing is I'm storing all that energy as elastic potential energy in the slingshot. And the slingshot doesn't have the same limitations as my muscles. It can move with a large force quickly. So a slingshot is an example of a mechanical power amplification device, and humans have invented loads of those things. Another obvious example is a bow and arrow. I use a large force traveling slowly to flex the bow, and that stores energy again as elastic potential energy, and all that energy can be delivered by the bow with a large force quickly. One of my favorite examples is a barbecue lighter. Inside there is a quartz crystal, and if you hit it really hard, it'll generate an electric spark. These two wires carry that electric spark up to the tip where it can ignite a flame. But you would never be able to hit it hard enough just like with moving your finger that short distance. So instead you apply a large force slowly, right? And that compresses a spring. So all that energy is being stored in the spring. And at some point you get far enough down that a catch is released and all of the energy that's stored in the spring is released with a large force quickly. And that's enough of a force hitting the crystal to generate the spark. The hammer on a pistol works in the same way as a barbecue lighter. And by the way, in all these examples, we're never using an external source of energy. All the energy comes from your body. It's just stored slowly and released quickly. Even the electrical energy in the spark ultimately comes from your muscles. So that's what humans have figured out. But what about the grasshopper? Is there something like a slingshot or an archery bow inside the grasshopper's body? So here's a diagram of the back leg of a grasshopper. And there are two tendons. The one shown in red extends the leg, so that's called the extensor tendon, and the blue one flexes the leg, so that's called the flexor tendon. And of course each tendon is pulled by a muscle. And in my model that's just these two ropes here, the flexor tendon in blue, the extensor tendon in red, and you can see it's just a lever that pivots around this point. This is the knee joint. That extensor muscle is big. Like, amazingly, in a large grasshopper like a locust, that extensor muscle can produce almost 15 newtons of force, which means with both back legs at the same time, a grasshopper could lift these 3 bags of sugar. So the peak force is huge, but unfortunately it takes a little while to reach peak force, about 300 milliseconds, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it only takes 30 milliseconds for the grasshopper to leave the ground once the jump has started. So by the time the peak force is reached, there's nothing to push against. That's a bit like the issue that I had with my tricep muscle. And then there's the big limitation of maximum power that we talked about earlier. Like, a locust could bench press 3 kilograms, but it could only do it very, very slowly, and that's no use for the jump. So the grasshopper needs something like a bow, something that can store energy and release it quickly. And this is actually something that you can see from the outside. Compare this jumping leg on the left with this middle leg on the right. Everything you can see here is exoskeleton, but the darker region is a different type of exoskeleton. It's much stiffer, much better for storing lots of elastic energy. And you can see in this video how it bends before the kick. A lot of these videos and animations come from Dr. Bill Heitler's website, by the way, which has been an amazing resource for this video. Link in the description for that. So in our model, we've added a spring to represent that specialized exoskeleton. I also added this lever here. That's not part of the grasshopper's body. That's just there to give my puny muscles enough mechanical advantage to be able to represent the immense strength of the grasshopper's extensor muscle. So here's the sequence. First, the flexor tendon pulls the leg up and it holds it there. So then when the extensor muscle contracts, it's not going to cause the leg to kick out because it's being held in place by the flexor muscle. Instead, it's going to cause that spring to contract, which, remember, in the case of the grasshopper, is actually a super stiff, specialized bit of exoskeleton that's going to bend like an archer's bow. And because it's so stiff, the extensor muscle has to apply a large force, which means it has to move slowly. And that's absolutely fine because what it's doing is storing up all that energy in the spring. Then all the grasshopper has to do is release the flexor muscle and all that energy gets delivered with a large force quickly, like that. But that's not the whole story, because the flexor muscle is much weaker than the extensor muscle. Like, the extensor muscle can produce up to 15 newtons of force, but the flexor muscle can produce up to like 0.7 newtons of force. So how is it that the flexor muscle is able to hold the leg in place against the much superior force of the extensor muscle that's acting to oppose it? Well, there's two things. The first is mechanical advantage. You'll notice that the position of this tendon is much further away from the pivot point than this tendon here. So this has mechanical advantage over this one. But even that isn't enough. There's actually a little bump inside the knee joint of the grasshopper, and the flexor tendon goes around that bump. So I've put a rod here for the flexor tendon to go around. So when the flexor tendon is pulled and the leg reaches this position, you see how the tendon is leaving the leg almost perpendicular. So almost all the force from the tendon is acting to turn the leg around the pivot. Whereas if you look at the angle of the extensor tendon where it meets the leg, it's a shallower angle. So it's only the perpendicular component of that force that acts to rotate the leg in the opposite direction around the pivot point. And it's the combination of those two factors that means the much weaker flexor muscle is able to hold the leg in place against the much stronger extensor muscle. There are loads of different mechanical power amplification mechanisms found in nature, and it's really interesting to look at the different types. For example, the frog hopper, it has one of the largest accelerations in the animal kingdom, clocking in 500 Gs. It does that by first pulling its leg up against its chest, right? So imagine like the frog hopper's body is up here, this is the chest, and this is the leg that's coming up, and they stick together by something akin to Velcro, so I've put some Velcro there. And then a muscle tries to pull the leg free, but it does it via some kind of elastic thing like this. So again, it's a large force applied slowly, energy is being stored in that elastic medium until eventually the Velcro gives way and all that energy is released with a large force quickly. The human equivalent might be something like a spud gun, where you build up energy until something gives way. In this case, you're building up pressure until the potato seal gives way. What about catch mechanisms? Do you find those anywhere in nature? Like, humans use catches a lot to hold back a large force with a catch that only requires a small force to release. And it turns out that the trapjaw ant uses a catch mechanism to hold its jaw open. It then uses a large force to slowly build up energy behind the jaw, and then it uses a small force to release the catch so that the jaw snaps shut on the ant's prey. This footage is from the Ant Lab, by the way, linked to their brilliant video in the card and description. So the trapjaw ant mechanism is not quite the same as a crossbow in the sense that the energy build-up stage happens after the catch has been put in place. It's a bit like if the string of my crossbow was slack when I locked it in place, and only then did I tighten up the string. Right, this is where I get distracted by a massive side quest, and I hope you'll come with me because it's really interesting. So thinking about all these different power amplification mechanisms, I thought of one. I was like, I'm sure I've seen this in a device before, but I wonder if it's ever happened in nature. So I printed this thing out to demonstrate. It gets harder and harder to open this thing up as the elastic becomes more and more stretched. But actually beyond a certain point, it gets easier again. And that's because of the shallow angle of the elastic. Like, only a small component of the force from that elastic is perpendicular to the arm. So it gets easier and easier and easier until, look, when it passes the pivot point there, it's actually slightly holding it open now. And you only need a really small force to close it again. I was sure that I'd seen a mechanism like this in a device, but I just couldn't think where it was, which is very frustrating. I even built an alternative representation of the thing. So look, this is a compliant mechanism. It's a bistable switch. I didn't design this, by the way. And look, it switches between these two configurations. And you need a lot of force to switch between the two stable states. But look, if I get it just like halfway between the two stable states, just as you're getting over that energy hump, you hardly need any force at all to move it around. You know, it's just as you get over the hump and then it races away to the other stable configuration. But what if you put a little nubbin there, right? So just as you're getting over the energy hump, the nubbin's in the way. So you hardly need any force at all to get it back to that first stable configuration. And I'm pretty sure it's the same kind of thing as this, right? You get just past that energy hump, you know, it gets easier and easier and easier, you get just past the hump, and then it's like on a hair trigger. But I still couldn't think of any device that employs this mechanism. And then I spoke to some people. If you've got any ideas, please tell me, because this video goes out in 2 days. Lots of people had ideas. By the way, tickets go on sale for our end of year show in a few days. I'll link to that in the description. A few people said, what about a mousetrap? But that's not quite the same mechanism. Like, when you're priming a mousetrap and you're pulling that thing back, it gets harder and harder and harder and harder all the way. And then you apply a catch to it. So it's not the same as this, right, where it starts to get easier just at the end there. David actually suggested the lever arch file. Just like the thing that I demonstrated, it's hard to move at the beginning, but look, eventually this is mostly moving side to side. So at that point, you don't need much force to move it. You're not working against this spring, and it would be easy to pop up if it wasn't for all that friction. And it's easy to pop up.
Stephen Smith mentioned these Boomph cards. Look, they pop up into a cube. Inside, there's an elastic band, and when you get towards flat, there's pretty much no resistance at all because the elastic band at that point isn't really changing length, but there's enough bounce in the card to get it started. My favourite suggestion comes from Matt Berrington. The compound bow actually gets easier to pull back beyond a certain point, so it's easier to hold in that drawn position. Compare that experience to a normal bow where your arm is quivering with the strain of holding it at full draw. That's a clever idea, isn't it? So it turns out that humans have used that mechanism a number of times, but I don't have an example of it in nature. If you can think of one, let me know. You know, it seems to me any way you try to categorize the natural world, you'll always be able to find some exception that defies your categorical rule. Like the rule that mammals don't lay eggs or fish don't fly or whatever. So I need to be careful because I've kind of implied that humans always do their power amplification through the use of tools and animals always use their bodies. But actually, I can think of an exception to both of those rules. Like, take clicking your fingers, for example. Try and do that directly without power amplification. It's a pretty weak sound. What we actually do is we press our thumb and finger together and slowly build up elastic energy in the muscles, tendons, and joints, and then we release it quickly, and you get that snapping of the fingers. There's only one known example of an animal using something external to its own body for mechanical power amplification, and that's the slingshot spider. It stores elastic potential energy in its web, then transfers all that energy suddenly into the web and its own body as a means of catching prey. How cool is that? It's interesting to see how new business models are born. Like during the California gold rush, savvy people started new businesses selling shovels. But these days, a lot of obscure, intangible things have value, so it's not always easy to spot the businesses that pop up around them. Take personal data, for example. We live in a world where that has value now. So of course, companies have popped up to make money off it. Companies called data brokers that gather information about you and sell it to other companies. I'll get to how the sponsor of this video, Incogni, can help with the problem in a minute, but first, why should you be concerned about data brokers? Well, it's not just about you receiving targeted ads and robocalls and marketing text messages. Data brokers are also selling your health data to insurance companies, for example. Some data brokers have been charged with supplying lists of elderly and vulnerable people to scammers, even collecting data on successful scams to refine their algorithms. But perhaps the biggest problem is data breaches. When a data broker experiences a breach, that's your personal information that is now in the hands of a criminal. Now, you can tell these data brokers to delete your data, and legally they have to. The problem is there are hundreds of them, so it's almost impossible to do on your own. So here's a new interesting business model that's actually useful. Incogni have figured out how to contact all these different companies and request data removal, and they've automated the process. So you sign up, you give them permission to act on your behalf, and they just take care of it all. Look, these are all the companies that no longer have my data. You know, I used to get these phone calls from companies that seemed to know a lot about me, and from what they were saying and the words they were using, I was like, oh, this is my insurance company, I guess. And then I find out it isn't, and they're trying to sell me something. Since signing up to Incogni, I don't get those phone calls anymore. The promo on this one is really good. If you go to incogni.com/science, you'll get 60% off the annual plan. The link is also in the description, so check out Incogni today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to hit subscribe, and the algorithm thinks you'll enjoy this video next.